Hey everyone, this video is going to provide the follow-up discussion to the week 7 discussion on Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So I asked you guys, even if you are already very familiar with it, to read through it one more time, and especially thinking of it as an argument. And then to answer the 7 questions that we answer for every discussion. So, first question is, of course, what is the issue being presented in this argument? Well, clearly, we are fighting for racial equality. That is the issue. How would you word the claim or the thesis? He says at one point, 100 years later, meaning after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro still is not free. That we've come to cash a check. That's his thesis. We're still not, we're still not free. This isn't done yet, right? That's his claim. That's what he's arguing for. Who do you think is his audience? Well, obviously, this was a speech. So his literal audience were the people there listening to him. I would say it's a good bet that all of them were in support of the civil rights movement. Not sure why anybody who's against it would be there. Maybe on the outskirts protesting, possibly. I don't even know if they were. But certainly his literal audience were the people there in support of the civil rights march. But obviously, that's not the only intended audience. He is also speaking directly to those who oppose the civil rights movement, or are on the fence about it, or maybe those who claim to support it but aren't actually doing anything to support it. It seems as though for that primary audience, the speech, the argument is a message of hope and to reinvigorate them, to keep them going with the fight. I think for the secondary audience, those who are not on their side, I think it serves as a warning that we're not done. But clearly, it's a speech, so there is a literal audience to think about. What kind of assumptions do you detect? Does the arguer assume anything about the audience based on how the argument is presented? I'm only going to answer this in part because I'm going to come back to it once I finish the questions. I think, obviously, the first assumption is that we agree that all men are created equal. We agree that America has not fulfilled that promise, and that he assumes that we also value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think they're all fair assumptions. What kind of proof and support is used? This is where I really want to focus. The first, it's interesting because he immediately, in the first few sections, in the first few paragraphs, brings up the Declaration of Independence. And I feel like it is a continuation of the Declaration of Independence. I feel like it is in some ways modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And I would have had you guys do these back to back. However, just the timing of other work in the class, because week 6, you guys had to work on project part 2, and I didn't want the discussion to be lengthier, so that's why I went with another image for you guys to do that week. But I think it would have been really cool to do the Declaration of Independence and then immediately follow it up with I Have a Dream. I'd love to actually put them together and have students compare them, but that's a pretty lengthy weekly discussion. But I think what's interesting about this is I do feel like it echoes the format of the Declaration of Independence. The first half of the speech really deals with logos. There is a logical line of reasoning in the information that he presents. He starts off saying, why are we here? Not just why are we here in Washington, D.C., but why are we here in this exact location? They're standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, or, there's the Lincoln Memorial. It's no coincidence that we're in the shadows of that memorial, the man who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It makes sense that we would do this here. However, it's been 100 years and we're still not free. So because we're not free, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. That's what the Declaration of Independence was. It was a promissory note that all Americans are heir to, that we all inherit. It was a promise that all men are created equal, that they are guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the next step in the line of reasoning, it is obvious that America has defaulted on that promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. It has come back insufficient funds for us. But here's the next step in the line of reasoning. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We know that there is hope that it can become a reality, that all men are created equal, and that we will get what we deserve based on what our forefathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence. We have also come to this spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now, that we cannot back off. We cannot cool our engines. We have to keep going, and we have to keep our momentum going. It is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. Then the next step in the line of reasoning, it would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of this moment. It's not just us. Everyone needs to realize the urgency of this cause, how strong we are in it, how unrelenting we are in it, that we will not cool down. And then the next step in the line of reasoning is sort of, he takes a step aside and says, but even though the urgency has to remain and we have to keep going full throttle, we cannot go the way of bitterness and hatred, of physical violence, right? And we cannot assume that all white people are against us, okay? We cannot walk alone. The next step is, as we walk, we must make the pledge, we shall march ahead, we cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? And then, this is where it resembles the Declaration a little bit. He lists the injustices, right? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels off the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating, "For whites only." We cannot be satisfied, and he gives a few more, right? And then he kind of closes off that section. That's the logic. right? Here's where we started. Here's why we're here. Here's another reason why we're here. We can't do this alone, so don't let it devolve into physical violence and bitterness and hatred. We need to walk together with all other Americans, regardless of skin color. So don't give up the fight when he moves into the pathos, which is where it gets really moving, if you will. This is where he gets into, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And then from there to the end, it's all pathos. Every single example that he gives, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He is appealing to our value of equality, our value of community, our value of fairness, and he keeps going on. I have a dream, one right after another. And then he wraps it up, talking about his children, of course, and then let freedom ring. He gets in, that's how he ends, right? And then he gets to the very last part. When we allow freedom ring, we will let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Huge appeal to freedom, obviously, right there at the end. So the first half of the speech is a little more grounded in logic because there is a specific line of reasoning how he gets from one idea to the next. And then once he's done there, he switches gears. And then he reinforces everything with this impressive list of appeals to pathos, of emotion, motivation, need, values, right? It's spectacular. It's so purposeful how he switches gears midway through. I mean, that is not on accident, but it's so effective. It's like he gets us here, and then he gets us here. And then it's just it's a slam dunk, pretty much. Question 6 is, what makes the argument interesting or effective? I mean, I think that switch, that beginning part based in logic and the second half based on pathos, I think that makes it very effective. Like I said, he hooks us with the logic and then brings it home with pathos. Very, very effective. I think the other thing that makes it effective and interesting too is, obviously we can look at this and analyze it as an argument, because it is. But it's more than that. I think you could also analyze it as a literary work, as a work of literature. Not made up literature, but just he uses so many elements that are typically found in literature. poetry and prose. There is so much figurative language. There are so many metaphors. I mean, that whole, even though it's based in logic, that's what's so interesting about it. That whole first section is based on logic because of how clear his line of reasoning is. Yet, it is steeped in figurative language. You know, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light, of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. Figurative language and metaphor right there. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Metaphor. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Such beautiful figurative language. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. Figurative language. So beautiful. And then he gets into more metaphor. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital of cash a check, right? They were signing a promissory note. And then a little bit longer, it's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. In the next section, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. He carries that metaphor through like 4 or 5 paragraphs, this idea of a bank and a check, right? And then, of course, the figurative language very much continues in the second half, where he's really relying on pathos more than logic. But I actually think it's more noticeable in the first half, where he's relying on the logic. So it's this really nice balance of logic and beauty, in a way. That's what makes it so interesting to me. What he relies on in the second half, where he's using pathos to appeal to us, the literary elements that he's using in that second half is repetition. And repetition without purpose is no good. Useless repetition, no good. Repetition with purpose can be super effective. And he hits that perfectly. You know, he starts that every, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. It's catchy. It keeps us in a rhythm, right? And we are along for the ride, following the rhythm. And it sets up an expectation for us. Let freedom ring. He does it again towards the end. It's beautiful. It's a literary work, and it is a persuasive argument at the same time. And I had considered using song lyrics and things like that as part of the discussions, but I didn't want them to be too much reading and writing. So that's why I went with mostly visuals. Plus, that's what you guys will be using for the final exam essay. You'll be analyzing one of the visuals from the discussions. But I really thought for a long time, I really wanted to put song lyrics, because this reminds me, his speech reminds me that literary works provide argument as well. And music, song lyrics would be considered in that realm of literary works, because it is poetry set to music. And they offer arguments as well. They offer persuasive techniques, just like the essays we've been reading and the ads we've been looking at. But his is so interesting because it is so clearly a persuasive argument. But it is also clearly a literary masterpiece. And I think that, for me personally, that's what makes it interesting. What makes it effective that does help make it effective. It is primarily effective because of how he presents the argument, the logic, and the pathos. The literary elements thrown in on top just fill it up and make it undeniable. So I am so excited to see what you guys have to say in the journals after this. Any additional questions or comments that you have, please include them in the journal for this week. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on and complete the journal.